Welcome to MAGAU, where we seek to educate our fellow Americans about the spiritual core of the MAGA movement and to evaluate how well MAGA beliefs and values conform to Christian, conservative, and American ideals. This is lesson 3 in our Foundations series, and the lesson is that good character is irrelevant to politics. As a case study, let's go back into the 1990s during the Bill Clinton administration, when Bill Clinton was impeached for perjury, obstruction of justice in relationship to the Monica Lewinsky affair. Now, the Democrats defended him not because he was innocent, but because they believed that it didn't matter, that he was an effective president overseeing a time of American prosperity and global power, and because he was doing a good job in delivering what they wanted as far as Democratic policy goals, they let it pass. Conservative Christians, on the other hand, objected that it doesn't matter whether he's an effective president. The fact is that he cannot be trusted. He cannot be trusted with the office because he lied, because he had an affair with his wife, and this reveals character defects in a man that it makes him unworthy of the presidency. Let's look at a couple of quotes from Christian leaders at the time about the Bill Clinton scandal. First is the Reverend Franklin Graham, son of the famous Billy Graham. Graham wrote, "If a president will lie to or mislead his wife, those with whom he is most intimate, what will prevent him from doing the same to the American public?" And then in the 1998 Christian Coalition Convention, the president of the Christian Coalition, or the director, Randy Tate, said this: "We have to be a nation that expects the highest from our public officials." In other words, it didn't matter that the economy was booming and that American power was at its zenith under Clinton's leadership. He was a man of poor character. He was a man who could not be trusted, and therefore they advocated that he would be convicted and removed from office in response to that impeachment. Now, this viewpoint was shared by the majority of evangelicals until the rise of Trump. In 2011, there was a poll taken by the Religion Research Institute and Religious News Service that found that 60% of evangelicals agreed with this statement, that a public official who commits an immoral act in their personal life cannot still behave ethically and fulfill their duties in their public and professional life. Now, in October 2016, this same poll was conducted, and this was in the aftermath of the release of the infamous Access Hollywood tapes. And just 5 short years later, only 20% of evangelicals answered this same question in the affirmative. Just 20% believed that private immorality meant that someone could not behave ethically in public as a public leader, as a public official, which is 40% change in opinion in just 5 years. We see this shift in attitude reflected in the way that certain evangelical leaders responded to revelations of Trump's multiple marital affairs, especially with the porn star Stormy Daniels. Tony Perkins, the head of the Family Research Council, said this in an interview: "We see right and wrong, we see good and evil, but also among evangelicals, there's an understanding that we are fallen, and the idea of forgiveness is very prominent. There is mercy. We kind of gave him, all right, you get a mulligan. You get a do-over here." Well, this begs the question, why did he get a do-over, but Clinton did not? Did Trump ever ask for forgiveness? Did he ever confess wrongdoing, the kinds of conditions that are necessary to receive mercy and forgiveness? Let's go back to Franklin Graham and see what he said about this episode. "We certainly don't hold him up as the pastor of this country, and he's not. But I appreciate the fact that the president does have a concern for Christian values. He does have a concern to protect Christians, whether it is here at home or around the world. And I appreciate the fact that he protects religious liberty and freedom." Now, hold on to that word protect, because we're going to return back to that theme. We see this sentiment in the common rationalization for supporting Trump in spite of his obvious and evident character defects. That we're electing a president and not a Sunday school teacher or not a pastor. In other words, character may matter to church leadership, but not in political leadership if a politician uses his power to do what he wants. A friend of mine who's a Trump voter, Trump supporter, who I often get into debates with, he echoes the same idea. He says what matters is policy, not character. I vote for policy. And so as long as Trump is delivering on the policy outcomes that he wants, then character is irrelevant, but only then. So what are we to make of this belief that moral character is irrelevant to holding political office, at least when a politician is using his power to protect you or using his power to advance the policy agenda that you have? Well, let's start this time looking at American ideals and our founding fathers' universal emphasis on virtue. Our founding fathers believed that the ability to govern ourselves and thus remain free was completely dependent on maintaining a virtuous character among its citizens. Let's have a look at what Samuel Adams had to say about this. Samuel Adams wrote, "Neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest laws will secure the liberty and happiness of a people whose manners are universally corrupt. He, therefore, is the truest friend of the liberty of his country who tries most to promote its virtue." Now, it should be obvious that you cannot have a virtuous citizenry, you cannot have virtuous followers if our political leaders are themselves not virtuous. Immoral leaders who are not held accountable, and they're going to infect the rest of the populace, leading by their poor example. Lawless, corrupt leaders will produce a lawless and corrupt citizenry. So the idea, we can conclude that the idea that character is irrelevant to political power and that all that matters is using that power to promote the right policies, that this idea is fundamentally un-American. Now let's evaluate this belief from a Christian perspective. Now we have to recognize that the Bible was a time where people did not choose their own political leaders. People lived in monarchies. They were subjects of a king or an emperor, rule was inherited. Kings appointed governors, etc. So they weren't choosing leaders the way we do in a democracy. Nonetheless, there are some timeless principles of leadership that we can glean from the Bible that apply to our times. First, let's look in the New Testament, where the Apostle Paul writes to his disciple Timothy, instructing him to appoint leaders for local churches and giving him the criteria for church leadership. And this is laid out in the book of 1 Timothy chapter 3. Paul writes, "Therefore an elder must be blameless, the husband of one wife, stable, sensible, respectable, hospitable to strangers, and teachable. He must not drink excessively or be a violent person, but instead be gentle. He must not be argumentative or love money. He must manage his own family well and have children who are submissive and respectful in every way. For if a man does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert so that he won't become arrogant and fall into the devil's condemnation. He must be well thought of by outsiders so he doesn't fall into disgrace and the trap set for him by the devil." Now notice that most of these are character criteria: faithfulness, self-control, humility. The emphasis is not on a person's wealth, on a person's status, on having an impressive appearance. The emphasis is primarily on character. Now, here the MAGA voter may object. The MAGA Christian may say, well, there you go. Yes, I agree. These things are necessary for church leadership, but it says nothing about political leadership. We're not electing a pastor. We're not electing a leader. Well, what reasons can you give that character only matters to religious leadership? Would you want people of poor character leading other organizations or institutions you're a part of? The mayor of your town, the principal of your kid's school, the superintendent of your school system, your school board? Common sense dictates that character matters in all sphere, because only when people have good character can you trust them to use their power, to use their authority for the good of the organization, for the good of other people, and not for themselves and not for their own benefit. Now let's turn to the Old Testament to look at the one instance where God actually is directly involved in choosing political leaders. And this is when he chooses Israel's first king, Saul. Then he rejects Saul and anoints David, the famous King David, in his place. You see, Israel was demanding a king because they wanted a strong man who could lead them in military victories over their enemies and protect them from their enemies. In fact, the prophet Samuel, who anointed Saul, says this about Saul. And when you saw that Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, came against you, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us, when the Lord your God was your king. And now, behold, the king whom you have chosen, for whom you have asked, behold, the Lord has set a king over you. In other words, God gave people the king that they wanted, the kind of king that they were asking for, a strong, powerful warrior king. But when Saul went to war against the Amalekites and was commanded by God to utterly destroy them and not keep any of the spoils of war and to kill their king, he disobeyed. He did not kill the king. He kept some of their livestock and other riches as spoils of war. And in response to this, God rejected him as king on account of his arrogance, quite frankly. And he commanded Samuel to go to anoint another king. Samuel was sent to the house of Jesse, and they were a family in the tribe of Judah. And while he was there, he's examining Jesse's sons and looking for the kind of a suitable replacement for Saul, looking for the same kind of warrior king, the same kind of strong man that could protect Israel from their enemies and lead them in military conquest. But instead, God directs him to choose David. And this is what God says. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. That's referring to David's brothers. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. In other words, God's priority for choosing leaders is the quality of the leader's inner life. The heart refers to the character, refers to integrity. So by dismissing character as the most important qualifier for political leadership, American Christians are basically taking on ungodly priorities, the priorities of the world, looking for leaders like Saul, who appear strong and impressive, who they believe can protect them and from their enemies and defeat their enemies for them. Now, ironically, I've heard many conservative Christians compare Trump to a kind of King David. This is usually done as a way to say that God can use sinful people the way that he used David in spite of his sins of adultery and murder. So they see in Trump a kind of David. Now, unlike Trump, David repented of his sins. And even then, the consequences for his country were devastating, actually even leading to a civil war. But I think it's more accurate to see in Donald Trump and Christians' relationship to Trump as a kind of Saul. He's a type of Saul, someone who's seen as a strong protector for whom character is irrelevant. And we see this again in Tony Perkins, leader of the Family Research Council, who said, "We are tired of being kicked around by Barack Obama and his leftists. And I think they are finally glad that there's somebody on the playground that's willing to punch the bully." In other words, what MAGA Christians seem to want is a protector, someone who's going to fight back against their enemies. And because Trump seems to use his power on their behalf and go after their enemies, his untrustworthy character does not qualify him. And I would just challenge you to think, if you are a Christian voter, does this wisdom, is this the wisdom of God? Is this the way of, does this reflect the mind of God? Or is this more of a reflection of the wisdom of the world to choose the strong man protector and disregard good character and leadership?